Good evening. Welcome to Critical Witness. It's good to be back. It's been a couple of weeks that I've been on here. You might have been with Dan and Nathan in the last chat. Highly recommend listening to that one about the history of Christianity and science. Definitely worth listening to. Tonight we're talking about philosophical arguments for God with Chad McIntosh or McIntosh, depending on how I'm meant to pronounce that. We'll bring him on the screen. He can correct me. Hi, Chad. Welcome. And we've got Dan with us as well. How would you pronounce it? McIntosh?
McIntosh. Just the A is not there, yeah.
My bad.
Weirdo,
welcome to our festive last of 2021 podcast show, video, YouTube thing. It's good to have you. Tell us a little bit about where you're based and what you do, and then we'll kind of start going into the philosophical arguments for God from there.
Sure. Well, I live in Central Ohio with my wife and two kids. My wife's a doctor here in town, and I have the privilege of staying home and raising the kiddos and doing philosophy on the side when I can. Well, actually, I'll be teaching a few courses here next spring semester at a local university and working around the house.
Nice. Good balance of the two things there. What got you into philosophy?
Yeah, it's kind of a crazy story. I got kicked out of my high school for fighting, and the only other high school in the district was a Christian school. And I think it must have been pretty obvious to the students there that I was a fish out of water, because before long they started evangelizing to me. And I wanted to return the favor, so I went to a local bookstore and checked out a book called The Atheist Debater's Handbook. And I memorized these arguments, and I was just pummeling these poor high school students who had never really encountered this sort of material before. And long story short, I wound up getting in touch with a youth pastor of one of my friends' churches who had a degree in philosophy. And I thought it was going to go similarly, as it was going to go with these poor high school students. And he just so graciously took these really bad arguments I was learning apart and sent me home with a copy of Reasonable Faith. And I think he may have even included God, Freedom, and Evil by Alvin Plantinga. And I was reading these books, and I was like, wow, this stuff is like a much higher caliber than the stuff that I was reading. I don't know how to answer this stuff. But it really piqued my interest in this material. And once I did finally become a Christian, I looked back and realized how important that material was, and wanted to pursue it myself.
Nice. That's a cool way in. I like that. So yeah, a long history of people trying to fight it and then come around to it. I think that's cool. And so I guess from that, I think your story actually answers the question I was going to ask, because there's a common, I don't know how common it is in the circles I run in, but I have definitely heard it online. The sort of argument of, we don't need philosophy as Christians because of that. Was it in Paul's letters that's I haven't come with any clever arguments? Yeah, Colossians.
Vain philosophy.
Yeah, he uses philosophy there, and it's all vain. So I guess your story answers why that's important. But I guess, do you have anything further to add from that as just a basic intro to this conversation of why you'd recommend, or would you recommend it to your average Christian to get engaged with philosophy?
It depends. Some people honestly, some people just aren't cut out to do philosophy. I'm thinking of like the 70-year-old church mouse who's, just loves Jesus and has no use for an apologetics manual or anything like that. That's just fine. There's no reason to railroad someone like that for not studying philosophy. But if you're a university student or even a junior high or high school student wrestling with these questions about God's existence, reasons to believe your faith is true, then absolutely I recommend it.
Awesome. So shall we just get stuck in then with some of these arguments? So I guess we're quite appreciative of the list of things that you've got here. So I mean, happy to start with that and just kind of ask you questions as we go along. In terms of the sort of main arguments, what are your sort of go-to if you're having a general conversation with someone? Where would you start in terms of introducing a philosophical case for God?
Yeah, I guess I would feel them out a little bit and see where they're at, and depending on different arguments are going to appeal to different people, and I would want to know a little bit about them to kind of select which argument that I think would have the most chance of success. So it's not a one-size-fits-all enterprise by any means.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I think there's the danger of any apologetics is going in thinking what they're going to respond with and to, and definitely digging around and getting to know someone.
I guess just I'd have a couple of prior questions, I guess, before we get into the actual philosophical arguments. I guess it does assume as well, doesn't it, that people place sort of value on the strength of a philosophical argument to sort of motivate belief. For instance, I could see someone accepting an argument theoretically and actually saying yes, okay, A plus B equals C, but it's not going to necessarily motivate the heart to actually embrace that content. To say, you could philosophically, accept that, an argument for theism is sound, but it not necessarily motivationally lead to any change. I guess that would be one sort of criticism of sort of what's the, why not just share the gospel? Why even start out with a philosophical argument?
Yeah, I think that says more about human psychology than it does the value of theistic arguments. I mean, people aren't purely rational creatures, for one thing. And for another, I mean, something as important as belief in God isn't so easily acquired or lost just based on being presented, one argument. It's usually tied up with a whole host of other beliefs and behaviors. So convincing non-believers can be a goal of theistic arguments for God, but there are others. There are many others, actually.
So what would some of those be? I mean, I guess one immediate sort of think of is to reinforce existing theistic belief.
That's
perhaps right. Go on.
Yeah, that's right. So theistic arguments can increase one's own justification if you already believe in God, or in my own case, theistic arguments can the way I think of it is grant rational permission to believe. Looking back in my own conversion, I don't know if I would have eventually came to be a Christian if I hadn't been exposed to theistic arguments. I didn't come to believe because of the arguments themselves, but they acted as a sort of they knocked down a lot of intellectual barriers that then later allowed me to come to believe for other reasons. So they can give people rational permission to believe. And maybe a last reason would be that we're simply commanded to be able to defend what we believe, right? That's important as Christians, to be able to give a reason for the hope that's within us.
Yeah, definitely.
And how many theistic arguments are there? I know a lot of people might know the sort of main three that sort of come to most people's mind would be some sort of cosmological argument, some kind of moral argument, and some sort of teleological, maybe design argument, something like that. Yeah.
Now there are, no exaggeration, hundreds of theistic arguments, hundreds. And one thing you have to keep in mind when you mention the cosmological argument, the design argument, is that these are really families of arguments, that within these families, there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of different varieties and versions of these arguments. So that's actually one thing that separates theistic arguments as philosophical arguments from other philosophical arguments generally, is that most philosophical positions that you might encounter, They usually hang or fall on one or two philosophical arguments and then epicycles on that argument. That's not the case with theism. Theism has the benefit of having hundreds of arguments on its behalf, which is kind of a unique feature.
Nice. You didn't talk about the ontological, Dan. Eric's
yeah, I know, but that one's.
Come on, then.
That's got, like, I don't think anyone likes. Does anyone like the ontological argument?
Apparently, Eric does.
No,
So, you're gonna have to fight Eric over that one.
I guess one thing as well I'd be interested in is what in terms of the sort of the heritage of theistic arguments when did they sort of become? Have they always been a part of sort of Christianity, or was this something sort of relatively? I know a lot of people go back to sort of Thomas Aquinas and his 5 proofs and things like that. But what is this something that has a lot of heritage within sort of the Christian tradition?
Oh, absolutely. And it predates just the Christian tradition as well, offering arguments for the existence of a transcendent being. You know, that goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, and possibly even the pre-Socratics. But yeah, the Christians inherited these Greek arguments and developed their own. And it's been part of the Christian tradition and intellectual tradition ever since.
So where should we start then? So in terms of an argument and discussing its strengths and misconceptions, I guess I quite like that you've started off actually not using the ones that I'd probably go to in the notes you sent through. Right? So natural theology, you've brought that up as part of arguments for God. What do you mean by natural theology? Because my instinct when I hear natural theology is to think of design argument and sort of possibly lump the two together. Is that not what you mean by natural theology? Is that my amateur philosophy coming out? No,
you might have that association because William Paley, his famous work is called Natural Theology, right. But it's mostly a book on the design argument. Well, natural theology is somewhat of a dated term these days. It harks back to the days when philosophy and theology had a much cozier relationship in the academy. But what goes by natural theology these days is really just the philosophical enterprise of giving arguments for theism, the view that there's a personal God. That's what we mean by natural theology. And if it were my choice, I would just retire the term natural theology and just talk about theistic arguments.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. I guess what's the grounding for it being natural theology? Then what's the natural bit? Is that just an?
Well, I believe the term actually originated in the 1700s to distinguish revealed theology from natural theology. And revealed theology would be reflection on things like sacred scriptures, divine revelation. Natural theology would be the intellectual pursuit of what we can know about God apart from special divine revelation, just by observing and studying nature all by itself.
Yeah.
It's sort of the distinction between general revelation and special revelation in that sense. So it's things that, isn't it? I understand. It's things we can know without necessarily knowing God actually revealing anything to us. We can look into the natural world, or through logic and an argument as well.
That's right. Cool. Yeah.
That's cool. Okay. I've not made that connection, so I guess I do know what it is. And I guess in terms of strength of argument, then, would you suggest that there are would it be that some of these are stronger than others, or is that just a very subjective idea of strength? I guess I'm wondering that.
I think some of these arguments, if you're honest, some of these arguments you gotta say are just weaker than others. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of subjectivity in how people evaluate these arguments, and that goes back to the point we made earlier: is that people are not just purely rational creatures, not brains on sticks. But there's going to be a huge range of arguments that seem to be really tight, and arguments that maybe just it's like you can kind of see it, but maybe not. Maybe it has a place in a larger structure, in a larger case. But all by itself, it wouldn't do much work.
Cool. Any further clarification on things, Dan?
No, I think it'd be good to start discussing some of the arguments we suggested. I think you wanted to start, with cosmological arguments. I think would be a good place to start.
Well, let me say that as long as we're talking about theistic arguments, in my research of the literature on theistic arguments, in order to sort of impose some order on this vast literature, I found it helpful to distinguish two categories. On one hand, we have traditional theistic arguments, and these are arguments that have sort of a perennial feel to them. They've been arguments that you can find all the way back in Aquinas and Anselm, all the way up to the present. And these are the arguments we've already mentioned, cosmological, teleological, design, moral. But then there's a whole other group of arguments that, for lack of a better term, I just call non-traditional. And these are arguments that they haven't received as much attention. They might be novel, and they might be just a little more esoteric and not easy to follow. So let me just go down the list here and say the traditional arguments are cosmological, ontological, design, moral, arguments from miracles, experiential arguments, and then pragmatic arguments like Pascal's wager. Non-traditional arguments would be arguments, metaphysical arguments from things like abstract objects, nomological arguments from like the laws of nature. Axiological arguments would be arguments from kinds of value that are not like moral value. They might be like deontic value. We can talk about that later if you want. Noological arguments, arguments from like mind or mind-related phenomena, like knowledge and consciousness. Linguistic arguments, anthropological arguments, like C.S. Lewis's argument from desire. And then a last category here would be meta arguments, from so many arguments and sort of cumulative case arguments. So for the purpose of this discussion, let's just bracket non-traditional arguments. If your listeners are interested in those, they could look at my philosophy compass paper I have where I survey that literature. And we'll just talk about traditional arguments and look at some classic misconceptions about these arguments and maybe some teasers on some contemporary developments.
Sounds good to me.
So I guess we could begin with cosmological arguments.
Yeah, sounds good. I just realized I was muted, so you didn't hear anything I said. Yeah, no, that all sounds good.
Okay, so cosmological arguments, broadly construed, seek to demonstrate the existence of a transcendent cause or explanation of the cosmos or some universal constituent of the cosmos, like things that change or things that are caused, things that are in motion or things that are contingent. So that's kind of what the cosmological argument is.
Sorry,
broadly construed.
Just clarification, because I'm an idiot. Contingent. What does contingent mean?
Contingent means that it could fail to exist. It doesn't have to exist.
Okay.
And that's in contrast with necessary. If something's necessary, that means it has to exist. It cannot not exist.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
Yeah. And so a classic misconception here, which I'm sure you guys have heard, is the cosmological argument is everything that exists has a cause. The universe exists, so the universe has a cause and it's God. And not only is this there's no such thing as the cosmological argument, as we talked about earlier. It's actually a family of arguments, but no philosopher, to my knowledge, has ever put this junk argument forward. And it's obvious why, because it's open to the ridiculous gotcha question, right? Well, if everything has a cause, well, then what caused God? Now, laymen might be forgiven for this misconception, but I'm just astonished again and again when I see this repeated by professional philosophers in peer-reviewed books. It's inexcusable. Yeah.
So how do you respond to that in terms of like, I don't know, the who made God sometimes just when you're new to it, it can be quite I know that's not meant to be a question or like, isn't it obvious? But what is a clear and succinct response to who made God? I'll be interested. Is there like a minute answer or something?
Well, the minute answer, the 1 second answer is just no one. Because the premise of the argument isn't that everything has a cause. That is usually a straw man version of the actual premise, which is that, say, everything that begins to exist has a cause. And obviously God didn't begin to exist by nature, so God wouldn't need a cause. So it's just a failure to grasp the premises of the argument right from the start.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. Just highlighting the premises first.
Yes, there's sort of a hidden premise, isn't it, that God is necessary. So I guess what stops someone just saying, well, isn't that a bit sort of ad hoc? You're just sort of saying God's sort of a brute fact. You're just saying God's just a brute fact, and that's sort of the basis for the start of that argument. It's very easy for Christians just to say, oh, God's just always been there, but that's not necessarily, I guess. If you're skeptical that an entity like that could even exist, it does seem perhaps it could be viewed as a bit presumptuous.
Well, it's just part of the very concept of God. We're not presuming God exists, but we are presuming the concept of God has content. We are presuming that it means something to be God, and what it means to be God is that he would be necessarily existent and not need a cause. But that also doesn't, and if God doesn't need a cause and exists necessarily, that doesn't mean God is just a brute fact or just a brutally existent entity. That might get us off on a rabbit trail that we might not want to chase.
Yeah, no, it just got me thinking ahead, like what I would say if I was trying to get that. I was just sort of thinking, well, again, we don't have to explore it. I was just thinking, why does God have to be? Well, it assumes there's one God. Why not? I guess why couldn't there be other gods, or a God that existed that stops, creates another God, and the previous one stops existing, or something? There could be some sort of endless chain of different gods. There feels like there is a very monotheistic idea of God kind of built into it.
Sure.
And I think
so. Part of a good, well-rounded cosmological argument, or at least a version of one, would be to eliminate an infinite regress like that, and even a regress again of necessarily existent beings. So you would eventually have to terminate the regress in a being that depends on no prior being. And to use Aquinas' phrase, and this is what all mean by God, right? But let me I think, just thinking about your comment a bit more, the question, well, who made God, or what caused God? Now, that's kind of a silly misunderstanding of the cosmological argument, or at least one version. But there is a version of the cosmological argument that has a premise, as its premise, everything that exists has an explanation. And so if you then come back and say, well, then what's God's explanation? That is a very good question, and the theist needs to answer it.
So how would you answer that then? So what is the explanation for God? That feels much more difficult to answer.
It is a very difficult question to answer. And honestly, I don't think many theists have given a good answer to this question. And that was the burden of my dissertation, actually, is to try to answer this very question. I think, just to give like the 30-second version, God exists because God has parts, and the parts exist because they depend on each other. And so we have a network of mutual dependence where nothing goes unexplained. But that's kind of an idiosyncratic attempt to answer that question. But I don't see many other theists even attempting to answer this question. So I do want to give justice to that question, because it is real and needs to be answered.
And is that a question that's posed by non-theists primarily? Would that be a sort of objection that people have commonly raised?
Yeah, they'll say like, well, what's God's explanation? And then usually the reply is something they'll punt. Theists will punt to scholastic phrases like, well, God's existence is his essence. It is his very essence to exist. But I just don't find those sorts of answers compelling or intelligible. So I think something more needs to be said about that.
So
Cool.
I guess I was going to say, what is the sort of strongest presentation then of a cosmological argument?
Strongest form. Well, it's gonna depend. What kind of cosmological argument you like. William Lane Craig famously distinguishes 3 types of cosmological arguments. He's got the Kalam, Thomistic, and the Leibnizian. Kalam tries to argue for a first cause by eliminating an infinite past. Thomistic arguments try to arrive at a necessary being by eliminating an infinite regress of contingent beings or dependent beings. And the Leibnizian argument uses the principle of sufficient reason we were just talking about, that everything that exists has an explanation. Now, I think all 3 versions are pretty solid. Right now, most of the action seems to be with Thomistic cosmological arguments, actually.
So that's around sort of contingency and
yeah,
right. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what? I guess something. I guess how would we get from because obviously with these arguments, what is the purpose of those arguments? Are they to simply show that that theistic belief is rational and reasonable, or is it intended to persuade someone to embrace the conclusion of that in terms of motivationally? And if so, what's the value of just persuading someone of theism rather than necessarily going any further? So are there any arguments that would argue for something more in line with the sort of triune theism of the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could discuss one of these kinds of arguments a little bit later, but typically, yeah, they would offer, or apologists or philosophers, they would offer, say, a generic argument for theism, and then follow that up with an argument for the resurrection or an argument for the reliability of the Bible or something like that. Now, I think that's actually kind of a bad approach because I think there's good reason to just start with an argument from the resurrection. Just start with an argument for the reliability of the Bible. We don't necessarily need to have this preamble on generic theistic arguments before we just hit the home run there. Yeah.
That's probably where I'd lean to anyway, just because I don't have that philosophical grounding really to feel confident to jump straight. I mean, I can sort of summarize the Kalam and maybe a tiny bit of necessity, but like Dan said, I think before we came on, actually, that the moral argument's been probably more something that I would naturally go to. But even then, I think there's, and we'll get to moral in a bit, I think my inclination is definitely, well, let's talk about Jesus' resurrection and the Bible and figure that stuff out, and maybe if the philosophical comes up, then we can look at that together, kind of, and let's figure out what that looks like, and I'll point you to some resources. But yeah, I think that's helpful. So I mean, you've talked about at least one misconception, who made God. That's really like a regular one. The other one that I'm aware of, and I don't know if it's classed as a misconception really, but it's like the response is, well, that doesn't actually point to a God. It just some element of I think that's a Dillahunty and a few other atheists are very much on this, that you can recite the Kalam, but it doesn't actually point to a God.
Right.
So I guess that's focusing on the Kalam a little bit. Is that a misconception that can be laid at the door of any of the cosmological arguments? But
well, we have to keep in mind, what the aim of a particular argument is, and if the aim of a particular theistic argument is just to argue that God exists, and whereby God we mean a personal being with at least one godlike attribute, like necessity, godlike power or knowledge, ground of morality, creator, designer of the natural world, and so forth. If you can establish that there is a concrete necessary being, well, then if that's the aim of the theistic argument, that's a good theistic argument. That it doesn't prove that this concrete necessary being is a trinity, well, that was never part of the aim of the argument in the first place. You'll have to resort to other arguments to fill out your concept of God. So we can't expect individual arguments to pull too much weight.
Does that just sort of highlight a limitation in of theistic arguments if it's related to sort of general revelation? Is there is a limitation in what you can what epistemic you can know from the natural world, that there is this very clear divide between what you're going to require to go a bit further is going to require special revelation, and actually general revelation is only going to take you so far, perhaps to the point of theistic belief, but not necessarily any further?
No, I think it just because if we combine the very modest conclusions of let's just say a dozen philosophical arguments together, we could have a very filled out concept of God at the end. What I think it points to is just that we shouldn't expect too much of individual arguments. We shouldn't try to prove too much with a simple syllogism or a simple argument. I mean, that has all the, if you encounter an argument and the conclusion is, therefore, the God of Christian theism is true, he's triune, and Jesus rose from the dead, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's, you better start reaching for your wallet at that point, right? That's what charlatans do. So, no, we have to make our arguments have much more modest aims, keep it simple, and then maybe piece together these conclusions at the end for a filled out concept.
That's really helpful. I think sometimes I've misread how some of these arguments have been used, even by William Lane Craig, and sort of I've laid too much weight on what I think he's saying, and then when I've come to actually using, or at least just pointing someone to it, I've then expected more from that argument than I've actually recognized. And I think maybe even you can see how that might happen with some of the responses that online, like Kalam argument debunked, as is often thrown around. What is it debunking really? when what is the Kalam trying to do, and then go from there? I think that's really a really helpful thought. Before we look at other sort of cosmological things, there's a question here in the chat which might help a little bit with our conversation. There's one thing I'd need defining a little bit, and the other links into cosmological arguments. So first off, do you hold to divine simplicity? And I guess within that question, if you have a short definition of what divine simplicity is, that'd be helpful. And then you can see the question on the screen there. But for the podcast, do you have to hold to divine simplicity to have the strongest cosmological argument?
So divine simplicity is the view that God is completely bereft of metaphysical complexity. There are no real metaphysical distinctions within God. I do not hold that view. I think that is more fitting of an Islamic or Jewish conception of God. I think it's fundamentally anti-Trinitarian. And when you look at the history of the doctrine, I think there are some precursors of the doctrine that predate Aquinas, but mostly we inherit this strong doctrine from Aquinas, who got it from Islamic commentators on Aristotle. And they reworked it explicitly in the form of anti-Trinitarian arguments. And I'm just not willing to follow that sort of historical argument here. So no, I reject divine simplicity wholeheartedly. Now, I do think that there's an interesting cosmological argument that you can give for a simple being, and that's just a regress of dependence. if one thing depends on another, and that thing depends on another, and it can't go on forever, well, you must have a completely independent being, including that being itself. It can't depend on anything else. But a completely independent being, a being that depends on nothing at all, must be absolutely simple. So, yeah, that would be I think it's a strong argument. And for people who reject the divine simplicity, they'll have to say something about that.
Hopefully that helps Dean, whose question that was. I guess I didn't realize that divine simplicity has that kind of history. So that was quite interesting. And I think Eric has voiced that quite well with "what" and several exclamation marks. So that's an interesting point.
Doesn't the Kalam itself have origins in in Islamic philosophy itself?
Sure, but the content of the Kalam argument is just fine. That's consistent with a Christian God. But an absolutely simple concept of God, no, I don't think that's consistent with the Trinitarian concept of God in the least.
That's really interesting.
Are there any philosophers who hold to divine simplicity who also promote these arguments as well?
Oh yeah, there's plenty. I mean, most Thomistic philosophers will promote these arguments. Some chafe at these arguments, but most Thomistic philosophers hold both value in these arguments and hold to divine simplicity. Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Rather than going down the rabbit hole of divine simplicity, because Thomas the Trinitarian, that's quite interesting. So anyway, that's where my brain's just gone. Are there any other sort of misconceptions that are maybe not so common, especially with cosmological, that you think are important for Christians to know about and not? I guess it's what are the trappings for Christians when engaging with cosmological arguments that you hear them misuse? I like the one that you already stated, is that we put too much weight on them, and I think that's really helpful. Is there anything else that you sort of you've heard Christians sort of regurgitate some of these arguments and you go, oh man, please don't do that? Yeah.
It would just be the one I mentioned. If everything has a cause, the universe has a cause. So just avoid that argument. Yeah.
That's cool. Nice. And then you've got a little note here that there's some contemporary developments in this argument. So I guess if they're so old, can they change? And
yes.
What can we develop on them?
I mean, we live in such an interesting time with such brilliant philosophers that it seems like I get updates on what's being published in philosophy, and it seems like every update includes a new twist on a cosmological argument or a new twist on an ontological argument. But what's all the rage these days with cosmological arguments is they're being given by philosophers a modal twist. And now modality is just the logic of possibility and necessity. And so in general, these sort of modal cosmological arguments rely on more modest premises. So for example, rather than say that whatever is contingent has a cause, they'll say that whatever is contingent possibly has a cause. And they'll it's probably a bit technical to try to go through here, but they'll arrive then at the conclusion that even from a modest premise like that whatever is contingent possibly has a cause. If all of reality is contingent, then all of reality must have a cause. So that's kind of the contemporary development that's going on right now are these sort of like category of modal ontological arguments.
Okay.
So what are the kind of strongest arguments against cosmological arguments? They're coming from philosophy or from science? Because a lot of the arguments that seem to be framed against something like the Kalam tend to be often rooted in things like the multiverse and things that seek to undermine the first premise. What are your sort of thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you have to take it argument by argument. For the Kalam, yeah, everything that begins to exist has a cause. You often hear appeals to quantum mechanics as having counterexamples to that premise, or the universe began to exist. You can find there's no shortage of cosmological models out there that require an eternal universe, not one that's finite in the past. But that would be the Kalam. But those again are just scientific objections. You have philosophers offer philosophical objections to these as well. You just have to take it argument by argument, and no premise is going to be rationally undeniable in any of these arguments. These arguments don't reach the level of mathematical proofs. They're not like tools with which you can bludgeon someone into certainty. That being said, no philosophical argument is like that. As far as philosophical arguments go, theistic arguments are just as good as philosophical arguments generally, and so it's just going to depend on the weakest premise of a particular argument.
Nice. So that's all helpful. Anything further on cosmological arguments? I'm good to move on to the next. There's no questions coming in for cosmological side of things. The next one, ontological, and ontological, is that purpose? No, that I always get ontological. What's ontological?
Well, we'll let Chad explain.
Yeah, so ontological arguments, traditionally characterized, seek to demonstrate the existence of God based on the very idea or concept of God.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And the classic.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Give a classic example then of that, and I'll probably recognize it, but I'm getting them mixed up.
Well, the classic example would be Anselm's, which is God. He defines God as the very concept of God is that God is the greatest conceivable being.
Oh, okay. Got it.
So if he's the greatest conceivable being, it's greater to exist in reality than just in the mind. So he must exist in reality. That's kind of a classic, very informal way of putting the argument. Now, a misconception about this is that the argument assumes that existence is a predicate. You may have heard that. This is a slogan that comes from Kant. The idea is that we can't just say God must exist because he's the greatest possible being or conceivable being, and it's greater to exist than not to exist because existence is not a predicate or a property things have on top of all their other properties. Things exist first, so to speak, and then have properties, right? You can't just add existence on top of a thing as if it's just another one of their properties. Now, I say that's a misconception because even though that's probably a good criticism of at least one version of Anselm's ontological arguments, it's widely recognized now that there are multiple versions of the ontological argument in Anselm, and of course among authors today, where this problem just doesn't even touch the argument at all.
So I remember listening. Did Alvin Plantinga come up with has got an ontological argument? Is it? Am I right?
Yes, that's right. He's very well known for his ontological argument.
So I remember hearing that and just thinking, yeah, like that. If you're like, that just seems right. Mm-hmm. But the thing one of the reasons why I have very little appreciation for ontological arguments is they just seem to have very little or no motivational power. Like they seem like a trick of the mind. Like you're like, that seems like that makes sense, but I don't care. Like it's got like no, like it's got zero motivational power. Whereas I think something like the Kalam, or especially more so probably the moral argument of theistic argument, seems like the moral argument has the most sort of motivational power. Like you can just feel, you're like, oh, that's hard to get around. Like I have to do something with that if that's the case. Whereas with ontological argument, it just, and again, I'm not knocking it as an argument. Like it's fascinating, but it just doesn't feel like it's got any emotional drive to like. You just.
I mean, it's definitely one of the more esoteric arguments for God's existence, for sure. I mean, this is an argument that metaphysicians and logicians just love, right? This is their wheelhouse. This is not typically going to be the argument that's going to move the man on the street. I absolutely agree. But like you said, that's not a knock on any argument. That's just, I mean, it's not like arguments have these properties themselves of, being more or less heartwarming. That's just our own reaction to the arguments, right? I mean, Bertrand Russell, but again, he was he was a philosopher's philosopher and a logician. He describes in his memoir the moment when he came to see that the ontological argument is sound, and he said it nearly knocked him to his feet. So it does strike some people as being having some personal impact. But yeah, I could definitely see how this is not going to reach a lot of people.
It didn't convert him though. Did it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it probably. I would be very surprised if there's no one out there who was not converted by the ontological.
I was meaning specifically Bertrand Russell.
Oh, yeah, he eventually changed his mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
What would be the best? Because what would you say from your perspective? What's the strongest version of an ontological argument?
Well, what philosophers have come to appreciate is that we don't need to assume that existence is a predicate. All we need to assume is that necessary existence is a predicate or a property. And it is. It obviously is. Things can exist either necessarily or not. And so given that, now here's where it gets a little technical. If something is possible, that means it could possibly exist. We can imagine a scenario where it exists. Now, if something is necessary, that means it's there in every conceivable scenario. Now, if something is possibly necessary, there's an inference in modal logic that allows you to say it is necessary. That means, because if it's possibly necessary, that means there's a scenario where the necessary thing exists. But if it's necessary, it exists in all scenarios, right? So it all comes down to the very possibility of a necessarily existent being. Is a necessary being possible? That's what the ontological argument comes down to. That's what Plantinga's come down to. Hartshorne's, Anselm's, versions of Anselm's. And that's where the debate now is can we show that God's existence is even possible? If we can, the ontological argument is sound.
That's where it gets you. That's why I liked it, because it's sort of it teases you. You're like, well, that seems reasonable. And they're like, I've got you. That's it. What exists now?
Now let me go ahead.
No. I'm just taking the bit.
No, so that's the sort of state of play, is whether or not God's existence is possible. And you have arguments pro and con. Now, a contemporary development here comes from the philosopher Eugen Nagasawa in his book Maximal God. He thinks we can avoid this whole debate about God's possible existence simply by defining God as the being with the maximal degree of knowledge, power, and goodness that's mutually consistent. Whatever conception of those attributes meets that extremity, their instantiation is now possible by definition. And hence, there's no need to provide an additional argument for the possibility premise of the ontological argument. It circumvents the entire debate, which is a very clever move. I don't know if that's, again, it feels like a little like it's more like a trick, but I think that's kind of a cool thing.
No, I like that. No, it's interesting. I think, like what Phil said, you kind of feel like, how your general assumption is like they're old arguments, how are you still developing them? But it's interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of research going into improving them and trying to. I guess that's the purpose of philosophy, isn't it? To kind of to listen to criticism and to either change or adapt. In light of that criticism, to produce something that's stronger and stands up to scrutiny. And it sounds like those theistic arguments are all going in the right direction. So what are some sort of common misunderstandings of ontological arguments? I know there's certain people have said about, was it like the island argument about there being, well, if you can imagine this perfect island, then it must necessarily exist.
Yeah, so that would be one. The problem there would be just that there's there's no agreed upon concept of what a perfect island would be, right? As Alvin Plantinga says, he's like, you tell me your idea of a perfect island, and I can always think of one more pretty island dancer and a few more, palm trees swaying. And so the problem there is that these concepts don't have what he calls intrinsic maximums. So there's nothing about the concept of an island that's going to make it like more perfect than another. Whereas there is something like that when it comes to a person. So I am more perfect than another person, or I mean, speaking metaphysically here, if I have more knowledge, right? Or if there's if I have more goodness, or if I have more power, and if these do have intrinsic maximums. There is something of maximum knowledge, maximum power, maximum goodness, and at those limits is where we identify the concept of God.
But then so is there sort of like a threshold then for goodness? Can't you just say the same thing about goodness and say, well, you can always be better? Like, what does it mean to be? I don't quite get the distinction. I'm trying to think in my head. Like, if you think about an island, you could always have one more palm tree, or one more grain of sand, in the sense that you can. But then if you flip that to persons, you could all have someone who is, one dial, one a little bit kinder, or. I'm trying to think, because that still works it still seems like that's a sort of gradient. There's not like a threshold for what does it mean.
Well, it seems like omnipotence and goodness are a little bit harder to define. Just take omniscience, for example. That's pretty clear. You're omniscient. You're maximally knowledgeable if you know all truths and believe no falsehoods. Let's just say you're perfectly good if there's no evil that you could commit, and for any good, that's you could either create it or permissibly create an alternative or something like that. There's not. I don't see the. I guess I don't see the concern.
Yeah, I think I kind of see what you were saying, Dan, as well, that while there might be maximums, it's always like that childhood argument of but plus one.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, I get it in terms of like knowledge. Yeah, like obviously there's a threshold in the sense that you can know all true things. You can know, and then if you don't, then you obviously are not. But it's hard. I think the whole notion of goodness always feels it's in a slightly different category instead of, because I'm not sure if that's the case. I don't read a lot around this sort of stuff. I just think in my head.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I read on the attribute of goodness. So yeah, that's a good question. I wish I had a better answer for.
No, it's okay. It's
on
okay.
The intrinsic maximum of goodness. Yeah.
That's cool. It's all right to not know everything.
Yeah, it's all right not to know.
Good. Should we keep moving? Should we go on to design
arguments?
Design. Or have we done I think we did talk about developments in the ontological, but I quite like the design, so I'm going to jump straight ahead. So, design. Would design be where fine tuning kind of comes in?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So there is this thing that exists that is Earth. It looks like it's complex / designed, therefore God kind of argument.
I don't know if I would put it that way, but you're in the ballpark.
Cool. We'll go. That's my own version of it. So that's where I'm starting from. So give us a stronger version of the design argument.
You could offer many different design arguments. Again, these are families of arguments.
Yep.
Design arguments can be divided up based on the phenomena alleged to be designed. So you have teleology in nature, things seem to have a purpose or a telos, an end, a goal that they're reaching toward, or that they're striving for. But typically, these are only agents have goals, or at least things that are designed by agents have goals. Then you could have the origin of biological life itself, biological life, which would include things like molecular structures and DNA, and then the universe. And here's where like fine-tuning arguments would come in.
Okay, and so I guess where would the misconceptions come in? I find them quite powerful, and I think a lot of Christians do. I do know that on the flip side, several Christians I know who weren't Christians to begin with, when they weren't born Christians, they didn't find design arguments that interesting or powerful until they were Christian.
Okay, yeah.
So I just wonder, what are the sort of misconceptions, or from a Christian perspective, what are Christians doing wrong with the design argument? Because I think it's quite common to have it as a go-to.
Yeah.
Look at the world, which is kind of biblical anyway. We look at the world; it looks created, therefore it must be.
Right. I think the misconceptions mostly surround Paley's version of the design argument, and the way that it's normally presented is something like this: some things in nature resemble a watch, right? Watches are designed, so we should think that some things in nature are designed too. No, but it's doubtful that Paley's actual argument is like this at all, analogical in this way. Rather, Paley draws attention to properties of a watch which imply design, and then argues that those same properties are also found in things in nature. So the argument structure is not analogical, it's deductive. If X has these properties, X is designed. Some things in nature have these properties, so some things in nature are designed. It's not that some things in nature merely resemble designed things, it's that they have exactly those features which entail that they are designed. So that's how Paley's argument probably more accurately goes. So that's probably the main misconception, is understanding Paley as offering an analogical design argument like that. But I think we have a stronger reading of Paley available.
That's helpful, actually. I think I've probably gone for it. It looks it, therefore it must be.
Well, that's not bad. That's not a bad, necessarily a bad argument. My former professor at Calvin College, Del Ratch, he's got a paper called Perceiving Design, where he argues, this whole business of trying to articulate the criteria by which we identify things as designed is misguided. Rather, we just see things and infer they're designed. We just perceive design. We can just look at something and tell that it's designed. It's not by picking out this feature or that feature that then we then say, oh, it's designed. No, we just look at it. That's it. That's all we need. And I think that's a completely valuable and laudable approach to design arguments.
I like it. Yeah, I'll use that. Yeah, some smarter guy than me says it works.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess it's trying to think of why there's if you look at something that has all the hallmarks of design, you have to have a good reason to doubt that it's not. Rather than, I think a lot of people often they assume that, well, what's doing the work is you have to, if it looks designed, but actually it's not, and you have to show me that it is. But actually, it's, I don't know. I've always thought if something on the face of it looks like it's designed, then it's certainly rational to infer from that it is designed.
Absolutely,
you don't necessarily know the process of that, or
and who would agree with you there, Daniel, is Richard Dawkins.
Yes.
And that's the burden of his entire book, The Blind Watchmaker. In the beginning of that book, he simply defines biology as the study of things which appear designed. And so he goes on. Obviously, he goes on to say, no, they're not designed. And he gives reasons for thinking they're not designed. Right? These are the product of natural selection. So yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. What do you think is the most what do you think is the strongest sort of form of those kinds of arguments? I think I personally quite fine-tuning argument. I've always found fascinating, and I think non-theists also find that there's some warrant to that argument. It certainly makes, I think, once explained in its strongest form, it certainly makes theism more plausible. Like, it's consistent with theism. At least takes you that far, that it seems to infer that theism is at the very least plausible.
Yeah, I think I would tend to think that fine-tuning arguments are among the more powerful design arguments. Although arguments in biology are making something of a comeback. Of course, there's Michael Behe with Darwin's Black Box, who's trying to repair, the sort of Paley-style argument against Darwinian objections. And then there are some arguments, being offered on the basis of information in biological organisms. Alexander Proust has an interesting paper out on how the genetic code in DNA is analogous to a computer program. It's exactly analogous to a computer program in that both have bugs, right? They both have bugs, which are the hallmark of designed programs. It's kind of an interesting development there, but yeah, I'm with you, Daniel, that the strength of the design argument right now definitely lies in the fine tuning.
And what are some of the common misconceptions then, or other misconceptions you think of? Say the fine tuning. What are the sort of strongest sort of arguments against the plausibility of that argument?
Strongest argument against fine tuning is going to be the multiverse, as you've mentioned. And I guess the misconception there is that the multiverse avoids theism. I mean, there are lots of reasons to think that even if a multiverse exists, that is no implication that theism isn't true. In fact, some philosophers think that if theism is true, there must be a multiverse. They think that theism positively predicts a multiverse. So just by virtue of there being a multiverse, that does not at all undermine theism. It might weaken some versions of the fine-tuning argument, but that's about it.
I guess from our perspective, as long as at least it seems to be, as long as there is a beginning of the universe, as long as the universe has a beginning, is that what's so? I guess as long as a multiverse doesn't challenge that, then it shouldn't be a problem, or is that not the case?
No, I think that would be more relevant to the cosmological argument.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I was just trying to think.
Biblical grounds. Yeah, I think multiverse and theism in terms of Christian theism.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of getting at. I was just trying to think, as long as there's a.
Yeah.
It just seems.
I've not heard that before.
Yeah, it does seem there is something. The multiverse just sounds so weird that you can't help but just think. And just weirdness doesn't mean something's wrong. There's
that's true. That's true.
There's
and
loads of stuff that's weird that's true. So.
One of the more recent books on the multiverse, on the fine tuning argument, argues that if multiverse is real, then if the multiverse is true, then this entails this view in philosophy called Lewisian realism, which is that there's an infinite number of concrete possible worlds out there. It's like where there's a counterpart of everything you can imagine. There's a counterpart of you in every possible world doing any number of things. Now, David Lewis, who's the guy who came up with this view originally in his book On the Plurality of Worlds, he deals with this objection to this view that he calls the incredulous stare, right? He says that, the most common objection to this view is the incredulous stare. He's like, but that's not really an objection. But, well, I guess it depends on how much value you put in common sense and in philosophical reasoning. I tend to put a lot of value in common sense and philosophical reasoning. So I would think the incredulous stare does have some force, actually.
I think it's one of those things where philosophy or us non-philosophizers tend to bring that incredulous there, because it just seems that that's totally unprovable. You'll never be able to prove multiverse, and so it seems almost more of a step of faith to go multiverse than it does to think God created, especially if you put weight in terms of resurrection and other evidences for God's existence.
Just to defend the cosmologists, they wouldn't accept what you just said as the case. They do believe they do have some evidence in support of a multiverse. So it's not, and that's, as I was saying before we started, about 50, somewhere in the region of 50% of cosmologists would accept the multiverse, and they would dispute the sort of classical Big Bang cosmology. So that's growing.
Is that coming from the sort of quantum theory field of things, where there's two states, unless one is observed or something like that?
It goes more. There's more observational data. They're basically saying that a lot of the observational data they have now fits within the paradigm of a multiverse, and not necessarily reducible to a classical sort of Big Bang origin of the universe. I can't get into, so I don't understand stuff, but that's I was listening to a podcast from a cosmologist a few months back, and he was basically saying, he used to think it was absurd. He'd go to academic conferences, and it would be sort of not taken seriously. But more recently, now over the last sort of decade, it's a view that's no longer viewed that way anymore, and that they will say there is data, observational data, that support that as a sort of hypothesis.
Maybe we need to get someone who knows what they're talking about on here, and they can try and...
Yeah. That's why I'm only saying, I'm being very careful what I say. I'm just saying what they say, and they would say that it's not a view that they would hold without evidence.
There you go. So we've done the rabbit hole of multiverse for a period of time there. Developments? Have we done any developments on the design?
Well, there's
about Behe and things.
So there's fine tuning, but one recent development is due to Rob Collins. He's he's the fine tuning guy. He's been pioneering work on the fine tuning argument for decades now. Now he's got an interesting development to the fine tuning argument, but just to sort of contextualize it, in the mid 20th century, physicists discovered how fine tuned for life the universe's fundamental constants and parameters are for intelligent life like ourselves. They have to fall within this infinitesimally tiny range, and let's just call it the anthropic range, in order for people like you and I to exist, creatures like you and I to exist. Now, what Rob Collins's recent work is pushing into is that he's arguing that there's an even tinier range than the anthropic range, where the physical constants could assume that make the universe optimal for scientific discovery and investigation by beings like us. And he calls this the Discoverability Optimality range. So, for example, the universe has relatively low entropy all throughout. But beings like us, in order to exist, we would need only a regional pocket of low entropy. Yet the low entropy all throughout the universe makes the universe optimal for observational discoveries in astrophysics and cosmology, which is precisely what you'd expect if the universe were designed to be favorable for beings like us. So the fact that the values of certain constants actually do fall within the discoverability optimality range is less improbable than even the anthropic range by many, many orders of magnitude. So this is taken to be even stronger support for theism than even just the anthropic range itself. So that's
interesting. I've come across sort of the observability stuff before, but I wouldn't have been able to articulate it in that way. It's more just like, I think it kind of crept into the sort of Goldilocks argument of this is just right for life, just right for humanity, and it's just right to view the universe, but not really in any details. That's quite interesting.
So how would a multiverse sort of challenge a fine-tuning argument? I get, is it in the sense that if you've almost got a sort of infinite number of different universes, that you're bound to just have one, you're firing, blindly, and you've got a target, if you shoot enough times, you'll eventually shoot the target, think, oh, what a great shot that was. That was completely accident. So is that the sort of main argument against it? Okay.
Yeah, that's the classic multiverse move against the fine tuning. Yeah.
And what would be a response to that, do you think?
Well, you could just go on the tack and just say that there's not good evidence for a multiverse. Mm-hmm. You could argue that multiverse theories don't avoid the need for design because most multiverse theories require a mechanism for generating universes, but the mechanism itself, when you look at what multiverse theorists say about them, needs fine-tuning. So there are various things that theists have said in response to the multiverse objection, but I'm not too familiar with them.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Maybe you got anything else you want to discuss on the regards to design arguments, Phil? Or?
No, I'm just seeing how much time we got. We might have time. The next three do look interesting. I think maybe focusing on moral, and maybe we can touch a little bit on one. Yeah. We can touch a little bit on miracles and sort of experiential closer to the end. We try and aim for the sort of 1 hour, 1.5 hours mark.
Sure.
So we'll go for moral because that is one that's carried a lot of weight alongside design for me, and Dan loves it. So let's go for there. What would be, so again, it's a family of arguments, but if you were to be asked a moral argument, what would that sound like for you? I'd be interested to know before I try and guess one.
Well, there's Craig's canonical formulation. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist, but they do, obviously, and we can give arguments for that. And so God exists. So that would be a very straightforward, simple moral argument for God's existence. Now, there are others. The popularity of this argument, I think, has overshadowed so many other interesting moral arguments. And when I was doing research on traditional theistic arguments, and this category in particular, I was just blown away at the variety of moral arguments that there are. Moral arguments have basically, there is no facet of moral experience that hasn't been woven into a theistic argument. It's very interesting.
What would be, so I guess what would be interesting, what sort of moral arguments have you come across that we might not commonly discussed in sort of Christian sort of philosophy of religion circles? Sure.
Well, there's a whole group of moral arguments for God just based on the rationality of behaving morally. So you might think that God in an afterlife is required for the rationality of behaving morally. Here's an example. It seems that it's always rational to behave morally only if God exists. Why? Well, because acting morally is always rational only if it's always what's ultimately best for me. And acting morally is always what's ultimately best for me only if God exists. Since if God does not exist, morality and self-interest come apart, leaving us with the question of why I should be moral when it's not in my interest to be moral, when I'd be worse off for being moral. It's if acting morally, if it's always rational to act morally, it seems like you need God in order to ground that rationality.
What do they mean? I guess I was just thinking that I'd like to see it written down. But when it's saying best for me, that seems, what does it mean for best for me? Because I can imagine that meaning lots of different things to different people when you say best for me. Because
right. Well, that could mean it could mean different things. But I think I'm trying to remember how Stephen Lehman, who's the argument I just gave, how he defines it. I think he just means like overall well-being.
Right.
Overall well-being. So not just self-interest. You know, I could think that drinking a 12-pack every day is best for me, but obviously that's not. He thinks that's one's overall objective well-being.
Right.
What's most conducive to your flourishing as a human being.
Right. Okay.
Interesting. So it's not just the morality of community and impact on others, but your very self, which is definitely not. That sounded, as you were saying it was kind of it did feel intuitive that was fairly strong. That because one of the arguments, at least from Craig's, tends to the two sort of rabbit trails it goes down is, well, does objective morals generally exist?
Mm-hmm.
But then the other is the argument around altruism. Like, is there ever a point where, or is altruism actually a reality? Is there anything that is done morally that isn't self-serving in and of itself? We end up with a bit of a rabbit hole, that one.
Well, that's another argument. Yeah, that's not often brought up, is that if there is such a thing as genuine altruism, then it's very hard to see how you could come up with genuine altruism on a naturalistic framework. But it's not at all odd to think that there could be genuinely altruistic acts in a theistic framework. So if there is genuine altruism, yeah, that would be a hat and a feather of theism.
Yeah, but can I don't know. I'm not sure I agree. I think that even true altruism, should it exist, would still have some survival value. It's just that it would have to be. It's not necessarily something you want everyone to do, but there can be times where obviously the group would benefit from individual acts of altruism.
What we mean by genuine altruism is sacrificial behavior exclusively for another. It incurs no benefit to oneself, one's kin, or one's group. So if that sort of thing exists, then it's hard to see how it could in a naturalistic framework. I agree that there are naturalistic explanations of altruism, but that's not really what they mean by altruism. Is not really what I'm calling genuine altruism. They're usually trying to explain altruism away. They're basically saying, no, it's not real altruism because it does have benefits to one's gene pool down the line, blah, blah, blah. So that's not really genuine altruism as I'm using the term.
What would be, because sorry, just as interesting. So can you think of an example? What would be an example of genuine altruism?
Adoption of non-relatives.
But I can think of that. So I'm just going to push, because this is where I can't do the other stuff, but the moral stuff that fascinates me. So yeah. I like because that's what I guess an example of that, I would say, well, that still has benefits, because then if you're thinking about an act like that, well, you're actually expanding your group. You're expanding the in-group.
It's not your group, though. On an evolutionary perspective, it's fundamentally not your group.
But it has benefits to the group. So even if you adopt people from outside the group who, let's say, for this purpose, are not going to harm the group, having a larger group benefits. Does have some offset benefits of having, if you have a larger group than the group next to you, then obviously that will have some sort of survival advantage, even though it's gonna be the exception. I think true altruism is really difficult to.
Yeah.
In the human world, it's difficult to. Difficult. You can always, if you're going to be an annoying sort of anthropologist or psychologist, you can think of like, well, I think there are some benefits.
No, I agree. Coming up with examples of genuine altruism as I've defined it, it's got to be hard, because it's easy to always peel back a layer and say, are you really doing it for, isn't there some
Hacksaw Ridge. Hacksaw Ridge is probably my go-to.
Is that when he jumps on the grenade to save his comrades, something like that?
He's basically keeps going up to. He's a medic, and he doesn't take any weapon into.
Okay.
And he just keeps rescuing people over and over and over again. And he's just like, one more person.
That's about as good of an example as I think we can come up with. Yeah.
That's my go-to.
Yeah.
What's the purpose of that under sort of a naturalistic theory? I think altruism is quite an interesting one, and I think that does become quite a rabbit trail. But I think it, like you formalized it there, I think that's quite. I find that quite persuasive. I mean, you can then end up just discussing altruism for the rest of the time rather than Christ or Christianity.
Right. Yeah.
But it is interesting, and why are we? I guess maybe from a sociological perspective, I don't know if this is true or back it up with data, but it feels like humanity is programmed in to be altruistic to an extent, or at least value it when we see it. And that seems odd.
Well, here's
that self-sacrifice.
Here's an argument you might like, Phil. And this is also one of these arguments that I don't think are that have received much attention in popular apologetics. And it's that the nature of morality is, it seems to be such that we ought to live up to the demands of morality, right? Failure to do so renders us blameworthy. It seems unarguable that none of us can live up to the demands of morality, though, right? And it's a maxim in philosophy that ought implies can. If you ought to do something, you can do that thing. So here's a conundrum. This is what John Hare calls the moral gap. We ought to live up to the demands of morality, but we seemingly can't. And so Hare and others, they offer this elegant solution. We can live up to the demands of morality, not on our own, only if we have the requisite extra human assistance of a loving God in particular, one who offers guidance and sanctification and the like. And other authors have specifically urged that Christian doctrines like sanctification and forgiveness are exactly what's needed for us to live up to the demands of morality.
That's cool. I quite like that. That's interesting. There's not too many times. I think with why I like design is I can pinpoint that through to the creation narrative in Genesis, and you can talk from philosophy into scripture pretty seamlessly. And I think that's why I like moral arguments as well, though I have gone off them in the past because it does become it becomes very easy to argue like the Bible is a moral textbook.
Okay,
and so it's very easy to go, well, your God is immoral because he commands X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, you then end up in a bit of a what is prescriptive, what is which is a necessary conversation at some point, but that may not have been your intention when you're trying to prove God to begin with, and then they use your moral argument against you. You end up with what is the Bible. So maybe it works inadvertently, but that's not your intent in the middle of the conversation. So, but it's quite an interesting one that you've gone from moral oughts. We can't fulfill those oughts. We need something or someone to guide, help, sanctify.
Right.
That's really interesting. I like that. I'll have to rewind that later. But thanks for that.
What are some of the kind of, if we're going to go with sort of William Lane Craig's being the sort of standard moral argument, what are some of the stronger arguments against those that kind of argument?
I think you just got to be a moral skeptic. You just have to say that there are no objective moral facts or duties, or do what you were doing earlier and say there's no genuine moral altruism. Or you can deny the principle that ought implies can in the case of the last argument. You've got to play the moral skeptic here.
I'm trying to think about Eric Weilenberg.
You're right. I was just about to mention and say, or you could just say that moral facts and duties and these things are just sort of like platonic entities out there, necessary features of the universe. Yeah.
Which is a weird option. I really like that because I read his paper and I thought it's fascinating because what he's kind of saying is that the argument's got such strength that as a non-theist, I'm pushed to embrace something that feels a bit theistic-y. Like it's in that direction. It feels that you're having to push yourself beyond the physical, whatever we mean by that, into something. There are these sui generis moral facts floating around somewhere.
Right.
You know, I know you don't even describe, but it feels like a bit of a capitulation to me. Like,
it does. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's what people think, but yeah, it does feel like a bit. It does feel like a bit of a capitulation. It's like, you know, who was the other guy? It was there's something about the moral facts, aren't they? Just feel, if you're a non-theist, it's a bit odd.
Mm-hmm.
It is a bit odd that we all have these. You know, every culture throughout history have had these sort of, you know, core moral expectations that we largely agree certain things are good, certain things are bad. There's a bit of debate in the grey, but there's, you know, we all agree cooperation is good.
Killing each other is bad. At least
murder is bad. Yeah. So it's just weird on atheism, isn't it? I don't know.
Yeah.
So I take that as a win for the theists.
And I think that's why I like altruism, because you end up, it's one of those. I think there might be answers out there, but they have to be sometimes a stretch. At least I find them a stretch. Sometimes even that's subjective, but that's cool. And any sort of new arguments that are interesting or developed recently in the moral debate?
Not really. You know, I would just point people toward some of the more neglected arguments, like arguments for God based on the rationality of behaving morally. There's the argument I gave, like John Hare's argument from the moral gap. I would really like to see someone develop John Henry Newman's argument from conscience. Let's see if I can pull that up here. Now here's his argument. Step one, guilt, shame, responsibility, and so forth. They're only appropriately felt in relation to other moral agents. But sometimes we appropriately feel guilt, shame, and responsibility for deeds that are done in secret, deeds that harm no one else. So guilt, shame, and responsibility for deeds done in secret are appropriately felt only if there's another moral agent that's privy to those deeds done in secret. So there's another moral agent that is privy to those deeds. The best explanation of there being another moral agent that's privy to those deeds done in secret is that there's a godlike being that exists. So probably a godlike being that exists. So it's an argument from moral conscience. I like that argument, but it all hangs on that first step, right? Guilt, shame, and responsibility, and these things are only appropriately felt in relation to other moral agents. If you could defend that, you've got a good theistic argument.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Argument from conscience. I like it. Why not?
Newman was a clever dude.
Yeah, he was.
So I'm just aware of time. So we got we haven't even touched on miracles and pragmatic. I think there's a question in the comments that we'll go to, and then we'll talk briefly on experiential, if that's all right. But we might have to pause on the others, despite and maybe do a part 2 in 2022. I could also point people to your hundreds of arguments with capturing Christianity. I believe we haven't done the push-ups that Cameron did, so we'll leave that to Cameron. So the question was argument from beauty, if I can find it. Do you find that those arguments persuasive, and any resources? Just because we'd like to talk about experiential, anything sort of to point people to in terms of engaging with arguments from beauty would be helpful.
You know, I haven't really found arguments from beauty to be that persuasive. I think that they have a place in a cumulative case. If you can, most arguments from beauty have as a central premise the objectivity of beauty. If beauty is objective, then yeah, I think that might actually be just as strong as a moral argument. But it's very hard to show that beauty is objective. Now you can get around that by arguing that the very fact that we have an aesthetic sense is evidence of God's existence. You don't even have to presuppose the objectivity of beauty. as some philosophers argue that way instead. So just as far as my own subjective appraisal, I haven't been super impressed with arguments from beauty, but I do think they have a place. And there's some interesting work being done on arguments from beauty at present by like Philip Talon. I think he's at Baylor. I'm probably getting that wrong. But yeah, I think that I would look for this argument to be made more robust in the near future.
That's helpful. Just sort of to hop back a little bit, is there such a thing as, like, instead of arguing for moral objectivity, which sometimes goes down like, where is that objectivity? Is it generally you go to the extremes? Is it ever wrong to kill, ever wrong to, and you end up with some pretty awkward conversations around some nasty things in history. Is there an argument for moral sense in that regard, where objectivity isn't, you don't need to hammer home objectivity, but that we have a moral sense of some kind? Yeah,
100%. There are philosophers who make the moral argument based on just simply having justified moral beliefs. We don't even have to presuppose that these beliefs are latching on to like objective entities. But if naturalism is true, there's no reason to think that our moral beliefs would at all be reliable. In the same way that maybe we wouldn't think that a stopped clock is reliable.
Okay, that's helpful. Cool. Sorry, just so within sort of, if we try and wrap this up in sort of 10 minutes, that works. Experiential arguments. Now, I'd say generally, if my experience of non-theists is that experiential arguments are quite weak, but maybe we can go into why that might be a misconception in a moment. So what would you is experiential purely the basis of that lots of people have experienced God, therefore there must be a God? Is that a summary, or is it a little bit more nuance than that?
There's some more nuance, this may be the most common reason people give for believing in God is just their own experience. But as far as massaging experience into sort of a theistic argument, the pioneer here is John Hick, and you guys have heard of Alvin Plantinga. I don't know if you've heard of William Alston, but John Hick's work really sort of preempted their work in many ways, and he argued that religious experience is so widespread, it's consistent enough, and it's persistent enough that if it is unreliable, then we should think the same of our sense experience generally. The general strategy for arguments from religious experience have taken this sort of form, this sort of parody form. They say religious experience is very much like this other kind of experience we have that we normally take to be reliable. So if religious experience is not reliable, well, then neither is this experience. And Alston's work in his groundbreaking book, Perceiving God, he argues that religious experience is basically just like perceptual experience. It has the same epistemic structure. It's justified in the same way. And so if you're going to attack religious experience, almost it's inevitable that the arguments that you bring against it are also going to apply to perception generally. So that's proven to be a pretty powerful way of defending the argument from a religious experience. Now, my preferred way is even simpler, and this comes from Richard Swinburne. He just appeals to this general principle of epistemology, which says, hey, look, if something seems to you to be the case, then probably it is the case. It seems to me that God exists, so probably God exists. And now I'm justified in that conclusion until I'm given reason to doubt it. And so far, I haven't been given any sufficient reason to doubt it. So, just based on my own sense, it's my own seeming that God exists, I'm justified in believing God exists. It's a very hard argument to actually counter.
Well, I've not thought of it. It does sound weirdly simple. It feels like the ontological argument in that regard. Like you've just thought him into being because you sense him. I can see why it is hard to counter in that regard. So
now
to be too many ways you can go wrong with that.
Yeah. So a shortcoming or a limitation of this argument, which I think you gestured to earlier, is that it only really that's only an argument that really is relevant to you, right? I mean, if you're talking to a skeptic, they'll just say, "Well, it seems to me God doesn't exist," and so you're at loggerheads, right? There's no way of advancing the conversation. And so here's where I want to pinpoint a classic misunderstanding about arguments from religious experience. Excuse me. And the misunderstanding is that religious experience has evidential force only to those who have such experiences. Now, obviously, religious experiences will have more force for those who have them. But what this misses is that religious experiences can function as testimonial evidence, which is very powerful to a broader audience. So here's an example. Suppose scientists report discovering giant squirrels in northern Minnesota. Now, that would be very unusual, but if you've got no reason to doubt the reports or mistrust the scientists and you've never been to northern Minnesota to check it out yourself, you now have evidence that there's giant squirrels in northern Minnesota. And your evidence increases with the number of reported sightings. Same thing applies to religious experience. People who are otherwise trustworthy report experiences of God. A lot of people, the vast majority of the world's population, in fact, and this applies in various cultures, at various times, various socioeconomic backgrounds, and so forth. So this is essentially powerful testimonial evidence for the existence of God, just based on the sheer number and variety of religious experiences.
That's uninteresting. I've not heard it put like that. I mean, the Christian relies so much on their testimony that it just sort of it's just a natural part of sharing life. But to hear it philosophically grounded is quite interesting. Dan, do you have any thoughts on it?
No, I've not thought of it like that. So it's it's an interesting perspective to take on that. I think it's very insightful. I like that.
Yeah. Cool. And any sort of, you've mentioned John Hick. If someone wants to sort of read up on that, are there any sort of developments on it? Is that something that is being developed? I've definitely not come across it in that way.
I don't. This is one of the few arguments where I don't know of any contemporary developments. I think the literature's pretty much stalled out on John Hick and William Alston for the most part, and Keith Yandell.
Cool. I'll have to look them up. I quite like that. There's just something about that that's just, I mean, it's awfully hard to argue against experience anyway in general. And I think the Christian does have to weigh up experience alongside scripture and alongside community. So individual doesn't trump community and scripture, but it can have weight in the midst of that. Right. But it's still interesting to know that it's been it's an influential part of the Christian's life to share their testimony with others. And that's just been a natural aspect of the Christian faith. And just hearing it grounded is quite interesting. So thanks for that. I guess in each argument, we have generally in each conversation, we have a final question of like resources that you'd share. So you've shared resources per argument and people can engage with, philosophers that are developing each argument. Are there any resources that you would share, maybe like a beginner, intermediate, and further that can really start to dig into these sort of arguments a bit more?
Yeah. Let me just give me 1 second here.
No worries.
Sorry.
So this is a book that just came out. Does God Exist? By W. David Beck, which I think is a very nice survey of the traditional style arguments for God's existence. It's got some of the history behind the arguments and pushes a little bit into some of the contemporary developments. That's a nice resource to have. Another is, well, I can't find it, but there's a recent volume out with Bloomsbury called Contemporary Arguments in Natural Theology, which is a very nice edited volume on contemporary statements on not just some of the traditional theistic arguments, but also some of the non-traditional arguments. So that's a good one to have. And if you want to stretch your brain a little bit and get a sense of, I don't have that one in front of me either, but get a sense of just how rich and rigorous the enterprise of natural theology is in giving theistic arguments, get the book 24 or so Arguments from God for God, edited by Jerry Walls and Trent Doherty. Fantastic resource to have on your shelf that are really challenge your thinking. That's written by philosophers of the high.
Cool. That's great. While I need to possibly go sort my dog out. Dan, have you got any further questions? I'll be right back.
No, that was good. I've just added that book, Does God Exist, by Beck. That looks excellent. So that looks like a really great book. That's going to be one on payday. I'm going to be ordering straight away. That looks great. In terms of anything you've written, have you got anything that that would be useful for us to point people to?
Well, there's the article I mentioned earlier on non-traditional arguments. That's published in Philosophy Compass. I've got a companion article on traditional arguments that's sort of in publication limbo right now. But if anyone's interested, I can send that to them. So if they contact you, they can contact and you contact me, I can just get it to you. So yeah, that's about where that goes. Oh, and I think you mentioned earlier the 150 or so arguments on Cameron's channel.
Yeah,
you can find a lot of the material there.
Did you really go for 150?
150 arguments, yeah, outlined all. It's pretty brutal.
How long did that take you?
It was 4 hours. It was around 4 hours, but it was so it actually wound up being so suppressed that I think to give the material its due, it should have been probably closer to 8 hours.
There's only so much you can be in front of a camera for. I mean, I think the longest we've done is 3 hours, and that was getting uncomfortable.
Yeah, you did well to do 4 hours on that as well.
You've got to have snacks next to you, and I'm not surprised Cameron was doing push-ups now that you put it like that. Chad, thank you so much for your time. It's been really, really helpful, and it's won me around to a few more philosophical arguments. I've been moving away from that kind of argumentation for a little while. Partly, I guess, I'm just hearing it being argued so much that you don't have a way to the Bible. And I think there's been a few that you've shared that actually, okay, I can see how it's not just theism in general, which I'm sure there's some value in that, but actually there's something in here that the Christian faith really has strength to answer, and especially that moral argument you're talking about with the gap. I thought that was really helpful. So yeah, appreciate your time. There's been some thanks from the chat. So Dean, London Theist, follow Dean on Twitter with London Theist. He's got some good stuff on there. And Claire on Facebook who said thank you as well. Eric had to step away, but we've had a few just chatting through as we've chatted. So thanks for your time. Dan, any final thoughts?
No, thank you very much, Chad. I'd love to have you back to talk about aliens and the gospel. I think next year. I think would be a good one.
That'd be good. And if you're interested in more of the arguments that do push more explicitly toward a Christian view, those would be more of like the arguments from miracles, which unfortunately we didn't get time to discuss today.
Yeah, there's clearly more that we can talk about, and we'll definitely line up a conversation in 2022. So cheers. I'll close things up here. So for those of you that have followed along a little while, we do have a Patreon account that helps just cover costs, and there's a few things in the pipeline that we'd like to potentially develop with that. So if you fancy put in a few quid or a few dollars if you're American into that pot, that would be amazing. But there's no pressure. We do this for fun, for free. And we hope you found it enlightening and enjoyed that. Do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and subscribe, share, all that stuff. And do give us feedback. If you listen on the podcast, please do rate it and comment on there. It just helps us know if you're enjoying it or not, and let us know what you think. And if you've got any suggestions for people that we might be able to talk to, again, just ping us a message. So thank you, and have a good rest of your day, evening, whatever time it is. God bless. See you later.